As you just heard, I am Denise Specht, President of Education Minnesota. I was just elected a year ago, and I'm going to claim rookie status, at least through this conversation, but it's a pleasure being new because I think it gives me a great learning opportunity to come out and talk to groups like you. Before that, I was the treasurer of our union and an elementary teacher, most recently in the Centennial School District. In fact, one of my former colleagues, Jim Smith, is here in the front row. Jim and I used to teach together in Centennial and have both moved on. So my background is in teaching elementary and middle school. I've taught every grade in an elementary school except first grade and kindergarten. Although I was born here in Minnesota and my parents started teaching here, I actually started my career in Texas. I taught down near the border of Texas and Mexico, and at that time it was probably the poorest area in the United States. And I think it still is. And I have a few pictures here to show you. These are my students, my first year of teaching. Like every first year teacher, we were assigned a committee, we were assigned something. And my assignment was to be the student council advisor. So this is my student council, my students and I delivering food to needy families around the border of our school. And as I said, I was very young when I taught there. It was my first opportunity to have an education career. And when I look back on those years, I think I look back on it like most first-year teachers do. I really wonder if I taught my students anything. I think more than anything, they taught more to me. And there probably is a tie there. The lessons that I learned in Texas really informed me at an early age about the inequities that Minnesota students face here. Those inequities are often called the achievement gap, although that's a phrase I really don't like. It implies that students of color or students in poverty are somehow inferior, and I simply reject that. It is true that some of the students I work with, the students that you know, face more challenges and have fewer opportunities than others, but it's simply not their fault. I prefer the phrase that many of us are using now, and that's the opportunity gap. The phrase achievement gap also implies that white students who do well on standardized tests are actually part of the problem. And if they got lower scores, would the gap be smaller? It's a question to ask. We're already seeing signs that districts are trying to close the test score gap by depressing that top end. These districts, the district I work with, are cutting back on accelerated classes and gifted and talented programs. And although I think that that approach is a mistake, I certainly understand why stakeholders and policymakers might do that. I think partly it comes down to the vagueness of that phrase, the achievement gap. The phrase is often used by the general public, people I know, as an umbrella term for the many, many inequities and injustices that Minnesota children face. Essentially, everyone who is against injustice will be for reducing the achievement gap and insist that their local school district do something. And the problem is that educators fear the achievement gap in comparisons with other states and immediately think that there should be some precise metric. The first and most important of those measures, I believe, is the National Assessment of Education Progress, or the NAEP. It's a federal test, often called the nation's report card. Many of you have heard about it. This is very different than the test, the MCAs, that most of our students just got done taking, and those are the tests that we read about in Minnesota newspapers. Instead, it's a random sample of students, sort of like a political poll. There are no high stakes, and it's designed that way so that schools can't teach to the test. It also makes the NAEP very different in that it's the only test that we can use to compare one state to another or compare subgroups to others in other states. So when you hear someone say Minnesota has the largest achievement gap in America, they're probably comparing with the NAEP. So let's take a moment and see what the most recent NAEP scores say about Minnesota. And I'll tell you right now that the largest achievement gap stuff just isn't true. and I'm not sure it ever was. So this slide shows that, number one, our state has record scores in 4th and 8th grade math. It shows that 4th graders post top math scores in the nation, and that 4th graders post the biggest gain in reading. Our 8th graders rank 5th in math and 11th in reading. That's not to say that we don't have disparities. We do. We have real disparities, and they're serious. On the next 2 slides, you'll see a clear relationship between test scores to race, both in Minnesota and the nation. We'll look at 8th grade math scores so that the trends are consistent across tests. As you can see, gaps remain between white students and students of color in Minnesota. I'll give you a few minutes to look at that. And the national trends show that in Minnesota, those gaps are also found nationally. The NAEP test also measures the gaps we talk about. This is the difference between average scores of students with different racial backgrounds. It also ranks them with a 1 being the smallest gap. And here's how Minnesota gaps compare to the nation's. These results tell me that our society, including the K-12 system, is doing an outstanding job preparing about 75% of its students on those tests. In fact, when our 8th grade students took the International TIMSS test 2 years ago, they had the 7th highest math scores in the world. They were higher than every country in Europe, all but 2 countries and all but 2 cities in Asia. However, the NAEP results don't tell me what we should do, how we should do a better job with those other 25% of our students of color. That's why Education Minnesota generally favors targeted interventions and investments, but resists the notion that we should blow everything up and start all over. That's not to say there isn't some urgency. There is. Those white students are becoming a smaller and smaller share of our student body. This slide shows a percentage of students of color graduating from high school. Every year, the student population of Minnesota gets more and more racially diverse. A greater share of students also live in poverty than ever before, and that's now up to 40%. Those inequalities for our children start literally on the day they were born. This slide from the Minnesota Department of Health shows that more than 1 in every 10 births to an African American or Native American mother was premature. I think that's astounding. The neurologists tell us premature birth raises the risk of several mental and physical disabilities and behavior disorders. And that's pretty daunting if you care about our schools and our state, which I do, and I know you do too. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here giving up an afternoon to talk with someone like me or to listen and talk about policy. Now it gets worse. There may have been a time when Minnesota could afford to let a large number of our students fall through the cracks, but those days most certainly are gone. Our schools now need to have a broader mission and frankly higher expectations of students. We now need to prepare every student for post-secondary education followed by a successful career, and we don't have time to waste. The former state demographer Tom Gillespie and former state economist Tom Stinson used to do a series of lectures in which they would forecast certain trends. And one of the big ones is that Minnesota's population is going to get older in a hurry. All of those new retirees are going to start paying fewer taxes and start using a lot more services. In fact, they predicted that by the year 2020, there will be more retirees than school-aged children in Minnesota for the first time ever. Gillespie and Stinson also tell us that it will take the most productive workforce in history to support all of those retirees. Anything less, and our state will be in serious financial trouble. So that's the workforce we're educating right now. Every working adult in Minnesota needs to have all of those students go on to lead successful lives and successful careers. Notice that I said that it should be our goal to help students lead successful lives and careers, not to achieve the highest test scores. Minnesota students as a whole do well on tests like the NAEP, the TIMSS, and even the ACT. But I'm really worried that we're using the wrong measuring stick on many things. There is a growing body of research out there that shows that test scores don't predict success in post-secondary education when success is defined as actually graduating. A recent study by the University of Chicago's Urban Education Institute found that the following behaviors were more important for college and career success: persistence, self-control, study habits, grit, and self-confidence. And when the Wallace Foundation awarded the University of Chicago a $650,000 grant to follow up on their report, the foundation's senior research officer, Hillary Rhodes, said, quote, "Young people need to develop capacities far beyond the ability to score well on standardized tests," unquote. She predicted that researchers' next report should help educators, policymakers, and funders, quote, "make a difference in the lives of disadvantaged children," end quote. So how does Education Minnesota want to improve the lives of disadvantaged children, particularly in their academic lives? It's a long list, and I'll start with our big overarching themes. There are policies we've worked on for years and will undoubtedly keep pushing in the years to come. First, Minnesota needs to lower its class sizes, starting with the earliest grades and in schools with the most financially disadvantaged students. We now have the largest class sizes in the nation. Reducing class sizes is one of the few education reform ideas out there that have been found to be effective in randomized control trials. And it's the gold standard of social science research. And it's also common sense. Not real sexy, but it's common sense. I know I was a better teacher when I had 17 students in my second grade classroom than I did when I had 24. And really, every single teacher in Minnesota would say the same thing. And I think that's why the new contract for the St. Paul Federation of Teachers includes some class size controls in the contract. Second, taxpayers probably get the most bang for their education buck when it comes to early interventions. Education Minnesota supports increasing access to school-based early childhood and family education services, high-quality preschool, and all-day, everyday kindergarten. ECFE, Early Childhood Family Education, is a 40-year program in which licensed educators work with very young children and their parents, their families. These educators really teach parents. They really show them how to be their children's first teacher. And unfortunately, waiting lists in these programs are common. For us, high-quality preschools are programs run by trained and licensed educators in which the curricula is closely aligned with the programs of local kindergartens. And ECFE, although it's a 40-year program, has seen the least state investment by its legislature, for sure in the last 10 years, and I think that's something we need to put on the table. All day, everyday kindergarten is pretty self-explanatory, and many of you in this room probably worked on that in the last legislature. As you remember, the legislature and Governor Dayton approved the funding last year to create universal access starting this fall. Third, we support providing health care, dental care, counseling, and other services in schools that serve high-need students. In EduSpeak, in education jargon, we call these wraparound services. Again, this isn't rocket science. Children who are sick, children who are in pain, because they don't have access to health care, will learn more slowly than healthy children. Sometimes the child's parents just don't have health insurance. Oftentimes they can't take time off from work to take their children to a free clinic. The idea of bringing care to them, the students, has a good track record. There are about 20 school-based clinics in Minnesota, most of them in the metro area, and I wish there were more of them. Every school with a clinic reports improved academic performance. And if we can't get a full clinic in every school, we also encourage bringing those services in from time to time. For example, Allina Health's Philip Eye Institute Foundation has been doing free vision screening in Minneapolis since 2008, and they expanded into St. Paul this year. Why? Well, their program director recently told WCCO TV that if you can't see, you can't learn. Again, common sense. There's a clear connection between substandard healthcare and substandard academic performance. And that's why some people think that the most education reform so far this century has actually been the expanded access in Obamacare, not anything that the U.S. Department of Education has done. And our fourth big theme for solving the school part of the opportunity gap is about school finance. Minnesota school funding is way too variable for long-range planning. Districts want to close these gaps, but their resources simply can't depend on the mood of the legislature, the political skills of a local levy campaign manager, or the health of their property tax base. Minnesota needs to move a financial system that's equitable, stable, predictable, and sufficient. And in the last 2 years, we've definitely made progress, but it's not enough. So, those are our big themes: smaller class sizes, early interventions, treating unmet health needs, and providing a stable funding system that will do all of those things well. They're not flashy, and they're surely things you've already heard about, but we're educators. We like to think practical, we like to think permanent, and we like to think sensical. We don't like fads because we've seen them all too often. So having said that, Education Minnesota also has a short game for improving the academic performance of struggling students. First, Minnesota needs to have a teaching corps that looks more like their students. Education Minnesota just finished a series of community conversations around the state about teaching. And no matter where we went in this state, we heard that the need to diversify the teaching force with more teachers of color is number one. At Education Minnesota, we're working on creating incentives to persuade students of color to become teachers of color. You'll be hearing more about that in the coming months. A diverse teaching corps certainly doesn't happen overnight. So in the meantime, we're working with districts to offer more cultural competency so that all of our members and administrators have access to that. We expect that we will help bring a balance to school discipline statistics, which also show that schools suspend disproportionate numbers of African American students. And it should also improve academic performance and make our schools and what we deliver more culturally responsive. So on a related note, Education Minnesota has been supporting the Organizing Apprenticeship Project and its work in education equity. I think you've heard from them maybe, or maybe you've seen their work, the Education Equity Rubric. I won't go too deep into it, but it's a school-based approach with a lens with community engagement in addressing these disparities. Education Minnesota has committed to making grants to educators in these projects, and we're also arranging for educators to get time off to lead community engagement efforts in those areas. I believe that we can also improve the teacher quality in this state through the 2011 Teacher Development and Evaluation Law, particularly because it includes personalized professional development. And because this is such a broad-based program, I'm not sure if it fits into the talk about targeting the achievement gap today. However, I know you've heard other groups talking about systematically raising the expectations of educators for students, particularly African American and Hispanic students. And it's a good way to teach that could be reached through individualized professional development plans that we'll start talking about this fall when it comes to the Teacher Development and Evaluation Law and its implementation. And I'll touch on just 3 more policies before I wrap up for our questions. As many of you know, Education Minnesota is very active, or was very active in the coalition of the anti-bullying bill that passed this year. Again, this benefits all sorts of students, so it may not count as an overall opportunity gap bill, even though it will certainly benefit students who have been missing school due to bullies and the fact that our schools haven't been as welcoming as they could. We're also working to expand the community school concept. This is a good idea that I think could also have a better name. The community school concept isn't about putting more schools in communities. It's about turning our schools into community centers with classrooms. It's also about building relationships and connections between educators and the school's neighbors. So instead of a building being used only from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. for students, a school could really be open all day and most of the night to serve all of the needs of the surrounding neighborhood. These schools are always a little different depending on the community in which they're located, but they could offer things like preschool, basic health care, and social services all day long, and provide meeting space and fitness facilities at night. They could also be a natural home to adult education classes, such as people earning a GED. A district employee would coordinate the various groups using the building, but they certainly wouldn't control them. The added cost is covered by local foundations and nonprofits. And there are already good examples of these community-based schools in Minnesota, like Johnson Achievement Plus right here in St. Paul, Myers-Wilkins Elementary in Duluth, and the Brooklyn Center Community Schools. And finally, I want to talk quickly about college and college costs. As I said, I don't consider the goal of education to be test scores. The goal of an education is to prepare a student for a successful life, and that includes a post-secondary education. Students of color attend post-secondary institutions at lower rates than white students, and students of color who do attend graduate at lower rates than their white peers. And it's a problem in at least 2 parts. First, we've got to lower the cost of higher education. And we can do that by helping students earn college credits in high school, although there's still discussion about the right way to do that. Education Minnesota represents both college faculty and K-12 educators, and we have a task force working on both sides right now. We're also talking with leaders of both the University of Minnesota and the MNSCU system on how to improve the integration of K-12 and higher ed. We can also lower the cost to students by increasing the state's investment in the state grant program, or by sending more money directly to the 2 major Minnesota MNSCU higher ed systems. This makes incredible sense to me, especially when we remember how productive each worker will have to be to support the lives of our retirees, including yours and truly mine and everyone else in this room. The second part to the higher education problem comes with counseling. We need more counselors at the K-12 level to guide students to the right track, to the right college or university. And right now, our counselor to student ratio is among the worst in the nation. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what Education Minnesota has been doing about the opportunity gaps. And it's a lot, and I'm really proud of the progress we've made in some of those areas. But in others, I know we can do better, and we're committed to doing better. But we're hardly the only group thinking about these issues. I believe that Education Minnesota is the 13th organization you've talked to present on education reform issues in the last year or so. And I won't go into long comparisons between our ideas and some of theirs, although I will point out a few differences for you to think about. Education Minnesota is a union of 70,000 educators, and about 60,000 of them are active K-12 educators. We're mostly teachers, but there are also nurses, custodians, bus drivers, and paraprofessionals that work with us. The rest of them are higher ed faculty and retired members and students. Our group has a tremendous amount of actual real-world experience in the classroom. And I see that experience whenever our 44-member governing board gets together, or whenever our 700 delegates to our convention get together to talk about policy, to debate ideas like the ones we've discussed here. Most of our members live in communities where they teach. Their own children and grandchildren are in Minnesota public schools and preschools. So I ask that you remember that when you hear our critics, remember that we are in every community. Remember that we are experienced. It's very fashionable to say that Education Minnesota stands in the way of every reform du jour. We've been called all sorts of names, but those critics never mention that maybe, just maybe, after all the years that we've spent in schools, after all of our children who have been in schools, that we can predict what will work and what won't. They also never mention that no other group in the education debate has members with more of their own children and grandchildren in schools. That makes education reform personal for us, very personal. But that certainly doesn't mean that we stand for the status quo. We don't. In fact, I don't know a single teacher who wouldn't make big changes today if she were superintendent of the day. And that doesn't mean, though, that maybe, just maybe, policymakers should listen to what we have to say. It does mean that. We want them to listen to us. It also means that maybe, just maybe, if someone has an idea for improving the schools, they should reach out to educators before they start pointing fingers. Golda Meir once said, "You can't shake hands with a clenched fist." And I try to remember that and keep an open mind, but some days are better than others, and this is certainly a good day. The other difference between educators and some of the reform groups is in our goals. We do not believe in chasing test scores. We don't believe in chasing test scores, although that is the directive from the federal government and the desire of some of the richest people in our society, from Bill Gates and his foundation on down. We believe that approach encourages a narrow, joyless system for our schools. Teachers are often told to teach to the test and offer courses that are only aligned to the test. Therefore, a well-rounded education is reduced. It's not what I want for any child, and I don't think it's what you want for yours. Instead, Education Minnesota wants our victories over the opportunity gap to come from life stories, not percentile gains. I want to measure it in first-generation college graduates, in new physicists, in economists, in doctors, entrepreneurs, and yes, teachers. And I'll settle for an African-American governor here in Minnesota. It's ambitious and it's hard to quantify, and we can't do it because it doesn't fit on a spreadsheet. It's time to change the debate about schools from closing gaps on a few bubble tests to preparing all students for successful lives and careers. Our state needs us to do it. Our kids need us to do what's right, and our union is here to help. So I hope we can all work on this together. Thank you.
Why is it taking us so long to implement equity policies in our districts around the state? And could you say a little bit to help people understand the difference between equality and equity?
Right. There are a lot of questions in that question. But I think if I'm understanding where this is coming from, it's really the difference between does everyone have shoes or does everyone have shoes that fit? And perhaps that's where I'll start is, are we at a point where we can provide every student what they need individually? We talk a lot about, one size fits all answers. And I think that, we hear that at the federal level, we hear that at the state level, we certainly hear that at the local level as well. So are we in a place where we can take a look at each student individually and make sure they have what they need? And I think part of it gets back to one of my points is that it's distribution of resources. And do we have the resources that can make that happen? I will not shrug off what the legislature just did. But the investment that was made in our schools, over the last 2 years doesn't nearly make up for the disinvestment that the state, did in the last 10 years. So I think that's one way to look at it, is making sure that we have the resources for each school to do what they need. One of the other points I talked about the counselor ratio. We have this debate inside schools all the time. Do we need more counselors? I mean, the ratio stinks. We're like at 48th. I mean, we shouldn't be at 48th for anything in Minnesota. I mean, not in our state. But there's also another side to that is, yes, we need more counselors so that they can guide students to where they want to go and help them make good decisions. But we also need mental health workers. We need school psychologists. We need, therapists. And I think that we have to have some sort of an ability to let a school community make sure that they have the resources that they need to fit the needs of their students.
In Minnesota, can we really talk about race and do something about it? Or, we've had this hard time doing this. We do need to talk about it. But something that you said in that question leads me to tell you a little bit more about our community conversations. Because, diversifying the education workforce is a top priority, and it's something that we absolutely have got to address. And if we're not, we're not going to really, I think, decrease our gaps. There are a couple of things that I'm going to just kind of riff on here. One is, one thing that we heard over and over and over again is that communities love their teachers. Communities love their schools. They might not like someone else's teacher or someone else's school, but they love their teachers, they love their schools. But despite that, not one of them would recommend teaching as a career for their own children. I think that's a sad state of affairs here, that we can't recommend people into this profession. And when we dug a little deeper, what does that mean? Why not? I mean, it comes down to a lot of things. Professional prestige, It's not a career that's going to pay off that high debt that I'm getting when I go to college. It's not a profession that gets a lot of respect in the media or in the community. And there's not a path, and there aren't a lot of people that look like me, in that career. So we heard it all of the time. And there are actually things that work. There are actually programs that have been proven to be successful. When we were on the Red Lake Indian Reservation, I was sitting at a table with two educators. One was a principal, and one was kind of in mid-management. I think she was a dean or a assistant principal. And they came from the Red Lake community. And I said, what brought you back to the Red Lake School? And they said, we never left. We never left this community. There was a program, a subsidy that was given to our school, and we worked with Bemidji State, and it was a program that simply targeted people in the Red Lake community to become educators and stay in the community. And I said, well, what happened? Where is everybody else? And like everything, the funding stops. It's one of those examples of you get a grant, you do good work, and then the grant runs out. And I think that's a tragedy. One thing that we also know, especially here in the metro area, is many of the educators of color are in the support staff ranks. So our paraprofessionals, our classroom aides, our bus drivers, our support staff that really do some heavy lifting in our schools and are part of our success. To me, you think about those professionals, they're already in the schools, they're already there. Why aren't we trying to find a systematic way? That is a pipeline into a teaching career. They love working in schools. Why are they there? They're there. They know what it means to work in a school, and they're already invested. So how can we create opportunities for them to enter the profession? And one thing that we heard, and again, it's not sexy, but it's very simple and common sense, it's you remove those barriers. If you think about a classroom paraprofessional whose job it is to work during the school day, so they're going to night school, more than likely they're going back to school on weekends to earn that college degree, but when would they do their practice teaching? When would they do their student teaching? Guess what? It's during the day. They can't afford to give up their day job to try to practice the job they want. So how can we provide some incentives to say, hey, we're going to pay you to be here during the day, but now instead of doing that job, you're going to be doing your practice teaching job. So those are, I guess, some examples and some things that we've heard over and over again. But lastly, one thing that I want to give a shout out for, because I think it was kind of part of the question, or at least the previous question is, or the previous speaker, our answers are in our own students. And why aren't we asking them why they aren't becoming educators? Why aren't our students of color choosing this profession? And how can we get them to view it as a viable option? So in some schools, they're offering like a Future Teachers of America program. I know there is one here in St. Paul at Como Park, and they've got a lot of good success. So we can't count out those programs either.
Denise, this question specifically is about the smaller class sizes, and it seems to be recognized that that's really valuable, but something is standing in the way. And likewise around creating schools as community centers and having more healthcare options, dentists, doctors, nurses, and things. What's blocking that happening?
Well, I think the small class sizes, it comes down to resources, having enough money or having enough classroom space to make that happen. But to give you, I know there are many educators or people who have been in the education field in this room, but to go back to that second grade classroom I talked to in my comments, when I had 17 second graders, I was able to read one-on-one, teacher with student, one-on-one, every day. I mean, I think there's a reason why we don't teach behind the wheel driving in a classroom with 20 kids. I mean, it has to be done one-on-one. And reading and writing and all of those fundamentals the same way. So when I was teaching students one-on-one reading, all of my students were able to grow in profound ways, if not at grade level, if not making grade level gains, if they were coming to my classroom with a kindergarten reading level. They were up to first grade or almost second grade. So that's one thing. But when my class size jumped just 7 more students to 24, I was only able to physically read one-on-one with my students every 3 days. That isn't even twice a week. That makes a big, big difference in instruction. So I think part of it is money, and part of it is the resources or the space that were provided. But I also believe there are a lot of creative solutions out there, and I know they're happening in other schools. I know there's a charter school here in Minneapolis where they have 2 teachers in one classroom. So perhaps that classroom has 30 students, but they have 2 teachers in that classroom. So now that ratio is cut in half. Now you've got opportunities cut in half, and you're going to see results there.
There was a time apparently in Minnesota when the welfare department actually had caseworkers go and live with the family for a day or 2 and spend time with them.
Yeah, so the home visit program is one that I'm a big fan of. I love it. In fact, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers has really led all of us in this program. They offered a training about a year ago, and I attended that, but we're also utilizing them, and they're doing trainings all over the state to people who want to be trained in the home visit program. I think it's important to emphasize that, the concept of, well, we're just going to go and visit these homes and build relationships. You just can't just do that. In theory, it's just not I'm going to go knock on the door. There really is training that's necessary, and you really have to go in that with a mindset of what you're setting out to do. And what I really appreciate about the training that the St. Paul Federation of Teachers is doing and that I went to is that you really have to commit to some core values when it comes to that program. And one thing that they talk about is that you go in pairs. So you go visit those schools with 2 people, not just one person, but 2 people. And that you insist on visiting the home. There are often times where people say, well, let's go meet at the library, or let's go meet at the coffee shop. No, we're going to meet at the home. Unless that's something that is going to be a deal breaker for getting that visit, they really commit to that. But one of the things that I think is so profound about that program and how we approach building relationships is that you don't come with a clipboard and an agenda. The only agenda you have is getting to know one another. Quite often, many of our families, when they hear that knock on the door, it means trouble. It means law enforcement is there, or if they know that it's somebody from school, it means that there was trouble at school. And that's not what this is about. This is about a sincere approach of building a relationship. So they go with nothing other than the commitment to build that relationship and to understand one another. So that future visits, and they don't just stop at one, it's an ongoing commitment to keeping this up, so that future visits then can talk about other issues or maybe make other connections. And I know, and you all know, that when you start building those relationships, it doesn't matter whether it's a school, a professional relationship, or being a good neighbor, those relationships matter when it comes to a team approach, especially when it comes to education.
If we need more funding for education, but we need massive amounts of more funding for healthcare, we got a real problem. And are people talking about how we're going to resolve this?
That's probably a question that is going to exceed my level right now, but I would imagine those conversations are happening. But when it comes from a legislative lens, whether it's health and human services or education, those are the big ticket items when it comes to what the legislature is going to fund. So I would imagine those conversations are taking place, but at times there are conflicts, and there always will be. I think I'm going to kind of veer off one conversation that you can actually help us with comes with a federal funding. Because right now our state funding for our schools is subsidizing the federal commitment to special education. The federal government should be funding special education at a 40% level. And right now they're funding at about a 17 or 18% level. So the funding that they're not providing is actually not then being subsidized by the state funding that Minnesota is providing. So when it comes to, you know, there's only a certain amount of money and how do we divide that out, I think that one thing that could help all students, every student, is the ask and the demand that the federal side of this fully funds special education. You know, that funding is for our special education students and our neediest students. But if they could fund their share, then the subsidizing that we're doing could be freed up to do some of the other things that we've been talking about. So Congressman Klein actually is the highest ranking person at the federal level in the Education Committee. He's the chairman. And I know that he agrees with this. It's a matter of him doing it. So at any point, if you have a chance to talk to Congressman Klein, let's get that special education funding from the feds.
What do you see are the key points of disagreement between the teachers' unions, MDE, and the legislature? And how are you dealing with those?
I'm not aware of any conflict between the Department of Ed and Education Minnesota and the legislature.
The two of you guys together with...
with the legislature. Okay, so Commissioner Caselius and me, or the department and me, and the legislature. Well, I think one example that I can talk about right now is that teacher development and evaluation law that I mentioned in my comments. So the legislature in 2011 passed a law that changed the way that school districts, and it's not a big change, school districts should be evaluating their teachers, and we teachers want to be given feedback and evaluated, but really what it did is it designed a very consistent, uniform system all across the state. So no matter where you are, everybody is going to be having professional conversations in much the same way. But what the 2011 legislature did not do was provide funding for that. So both the commissioner and I agree that an unfunded mandate is not the way to go, and it's not going to be helpful in this conversation. When we first took a look at the law, the cost estimates given by our experts across the street at the Capitol, it was about $300 million was the cost to implement the law. Last year, we worked with the legislature to have a conversation about what are some of maybe the unnecessary parts of that law, or some of the things that are really big cost drivers. One of them is value-added measures, which really requires high-level statisticians and a lot of Jim Smiths. Jim's in the audience, and that's what he does. But it would also require a lot of computer software and things like that. And so we tweaked the law with the legislature to kind of pare down some of those costs and some of those things that we know maybe are not productive in improving an educator's practice. So we pared down the costs, so it got less. And then this year, we actually worked with the legislature to align that law with a law or a program that many of you might not be aware of, QComp, or the alternative pay system that came to Minnesota in the Palenti years, which has a lot of duplication or a lot of similarities to it. So what we've done is we've aligned the teacher development and evaluation law and QComp so that there is some sense to it. We've found where they overlap. Every district should do that. And then where we've got the QComp as a unique set of opportunities, that's not a mandatory thing, and school districts get to do that. So we've now kind of estimated that aligning those two together would cost about $80 million for the state. So that's what we came in asking for this year. But the one disagreement that I think we've all had, and we know it, is this was not a funding year. This was not a year to talk about $80 million. But the conversation that we've been having over and over and over again is this is a deal breaker for our profession. It really is. I want to be a better educator, And the only way I'm going to be a better, or one of the ways I'm going to be a better educator is through a conversation with someone who knows what I do, to give me feedback and to give me ideas on how I can get better. And that's meaningful for me. I want to get better. But I also view this as an extreme unfunded opportunity in my profession. I've been teaching since 1989, and I think this is the first time since 1989 that we've had a real good conversation about, a very serious conversation about making educators better at what they do. And I'm not going to get better if this isn't done well. And right now, without funding, school districts are going to cheapen this law. They're going to put it together on the fly. They're going to MacGyver what they're already doing because they can't afford to make this happen. And then I do believe we're going to see a missed opportunity. So we're talking about funding.
So I'm going to build on that. Is there an effort being made to identify teachers who can be good coaches and giving them the training to be able truly to be the good coaches we all want?
Well, I would never speak for the principals, but I think that they would agree that they would love more training. They would love more support. And I think everybody in this space agrees that professional development matters and that a rigorous process getting into the profession or into that training is absolutely critical. So I think that we would agree with that. When it comes to coaches, yes, absolutely. We do need training to be good coaches and to help our colleagues in their profession. I've got a very short story. I know we're really limited here, but I just heard from a first grade teacher in Rochester whose principal is a high school teacher. So he started in as a high school teacher. He's now an elementary principal. So what he knows and how he was trained is really that high school teaching model. So she's a first grade teacher whose lesson plans are really in about 10-minute increments, and kids are up and moving all of the time. If you've been in a first grade classroom or had a first grade birthday party, you know what first graders are like. They learn out loud, they learn moving, they talk to one another, and they love being playful, but they also want to be good learners. And this high school principal just had no lens for what that first grade teacher was doing. So when they had that professional conversation, that evaluation conversation that we're talking about, his recommendation was, well, your students are too noisy. They need to be quiet when they're reading. Things like, they should be reading for 45 minutes silently. Well, everybody in the primary level knows that isn't what good teaching is for a first grader. And I think that's maybe one analogy or one story that I can give to the fact that we do need trained people to understand what we do. And that's why every teacher I know says that while they recognize that there does need to be an official, formal conversation between my administrator, who I report to, and what I do in the classroom. But the very best feedback, the most meaningful feedback they get is from their peers, from the people who know what they do, know why they're having the kids get up every 10 minutes, or why they're having their students whisper read instead of reading silently. That's where I think the magic happens, and I think that's the best coaching that can take place. So we do advocate for something we call peer assistance and review. Peer coaching is what's going to help us.
This is another challenging question. It's a question that's out there. Why has the teachers union been so resistant to alternative licensure programs in Minnesota?
Well, I'll say this. There have always been alternative pathways to teaching. There have been portfolio models and other ways to get a teaching license. I think maybe where there is a misunderstanding is really about keeping standards high. What does it mean in Minnesota to hold a license? That's very personal to us. And I believe that's the conversation that we need to be having. What is quality teaching? When the state of Minnesota, when the Board of Teaching gives that license, to people who are going to be licensed to teach in our classrooms, what does that mean? And I believe in high standards. I believe in a rigorous process. I know that there are areas in our profession that are hard to staff, hard to find, and we need to have those conversations. But I think from a profession where our concern is we do not want a watered down process in our licensure. We don't want low standards. Not to mention the fact that I think in Minnesota we have a lot of pride in our license. A Minnesota license means something. It means a lot. And I think we have to ask ourselves, do we want another state defining that license? And I think that's part of that conversation that took place a couple of years ago, and it's a conversation that I know continues.
There's another question the general public has, and it has to deal with those teachers that are just not performing up to standards. They've gotten help, and it's just not working out.
I think one thing that we take very seriously are not only the high standards of our license, but the high standards that we have as professionals once we get that license and we're in our classrooms. And we want to be there to support and help our colleagues no matter what. But I think that's where the misunderstanding comes. And I know it's out there, they're protecting the bad teachers and they hide behind those bad teachers or figure out ways to keep them in the profession. And I think that there are two things that we need to really focus on. One is a union stands for a fair process, a fair conversation. That's what we ask for and that's what we work for. Making sure that everybody in the conversation has a fair opportunity to get better or to have that conversation about what's a better route for you. Secondly, I think it comes down to what we've been talking about for a lot of our time here, and it's a good, strong evaluation system. It's something that we believe in, I believe in it, and we have such an opportunity to support and create an environment where good teachers are getting great, good teachers are getting better, or teachers who need help are getting the support they need. And when we create and provide a space where everybody is having that conversation of what they need to get better and being good about it, then we're going to have a lot of improvement. But part of that conversation definitely needs to be what happens when a teacher doesn't want to improve? What happens when an educator can't improve? We have to be part of that conversation, and we're not afraid of those conversations. And those are conversations we have all of the time with our colleagues. How do we find another path for you in or out of education? So it's a conversation we're having, probably not a conversation that you hear a lot about. That isn't what makes headlines, how we're coaching people out of a profession. It seems to be kind of what we hear a lot about is finger pointing and trying to find somebody to blame for all of these complex problems that we just got done talking about. So I'm a firm believer in yes, we need to have those conversations and we are part of them, but two, let's provide an opportunity and a system so that educators can get the resources that they need to get better. But then when it comes down to I refuse to get better or I can't, that's a whole nother discussion.
What's the union doing with career and technical education and connecting with community colleges?
Sure. Well, we just have a physical connection because we represent the career and technical faculty in the MNSCU system. So we talk all the time about how they enrich Minnesota and how those colleges and those careers really are economic drivers for our state. So we love to talk about investing in our career and technical institutions because we simply know that that is how we are going to grow our state economically. I think it also speaks to some of the difficult conversations that we don't get to have when we don't have enough school counselors to have those good conversations about, hey Denise, these are all of the options out there. Have you thought about Rainy River Technical College? Have you thought about the University of Minnesota? We don't have time or have the resources to have those conversations. So I know that we have cut out some of those career and technical programs even in our own high schools and our middle schools as well. You know, those are the budget cuts that we've had to face. One of my colleagues, our Vice President, Paul Mueller, was a career and technical educator in the Brooklyn Center schools. His job is gone. I mean, I love him as a colleague, but if he wanted to go back and teach career and technical education at Brooklyn Center, he wouldn't have a job. It's not tested. It's not what we're focusing on. And it gets right back to what I talked to before. We have got to stop preparing kids for tests. We have got to invest in preparing students for successful lives. And as you said, a successful life might mean being a doctor. It might mean being a welder. It might mean being an apprentice at some of those career and technical colleges that we're talking about. Those are the important conversations we have to have, and we cannot forget about those options.
How we educate the parents of our children to be able to navigate the K-12 system so their children are fully prepared for college or career.
So I'll throw out a few ideas that I think would be helpful. I mean, something as simple as the home visit project that we talked about, I think is one great way to start getting a good channel of information from the home to the school and from the school at home. And all of those programs that you mentioned were good ones. And I think another thing that we should really strongly consider is that notion of the full-service community school model that I spoke about in my remarks. When you think about a school that has full services, so counselors to talk to parents about those options, or some of those very options for those families to participate in themselves, to make sure that the families of the students that we work with understand the educational options for their students, but also for themselves. You know, what options do I have? What can I do? But I think that the relationship building also goes just as far as just helping a parent understand their rights as a parent and how to be a good parent. That early childhood family education, and how do we start when parents are young parents, and how do we be a good family there. One quick story. You know, I talk a lot about the test prep and the disservice that these high stakes tests have on our students. So somebody told me the story of English language learners in a school. I won't identify it. You know, they have some very good instruction opportunities for them. They've got great ELL teachers. They are integrated into the classrooms when they can and with their peers. But during test season, you know, our kids are focused on taking tests. Right before that, it's test prep season. And the English language learner students in this school were really taken out of their regular ed for test prep. And they were labeled green, yellow, and red. And the green English language learner students were considered, okay, they're test ready. They know enough of their second language to get by on that test, and we think they'll pass. So they get to go back to their classrooms and the instruction that they should be having. The red students were labeled red because they just didn't feel like there was really any hope in them passing the test. That, you know what, they don't know enough of the second language, they're not going to pass that test. We're going to send them back to the instruction that they should be getting. But there was this big group of yellow students, the students in the middle, the students that were this close to grasping that second language, the students that were this close to making it, but they were the ones that needed their English learning services. They needed instruction on how to adapt to that school, not how to take that test. But they were pulled out and taught not how to learn English, but how to identify the right answer. I think that's criminal. And their parents probably can't navigate through the system or know that wasn't part of the instruction they should have had. So we need to get real about this. We need to start focusing on the right things. But we also need to be transparent and genuine when it comes to building relationships with the families of the students that we work with.
Thank you.